This episode will deal with sensitive topics, including but not limited to transphobia and violence, and some of this material our listeners might find unsettling. Listener discretion is advised.
Okay, hello and everyone, welcome to the OUTcast Podcast. I am your host, Leo. My pronouns are he, him.
My name is Rose and my pronouns are she, her.
My name is Luke. My pronouns are he, him.
For today's episode, we will be interviewing former Air Force intelligence analyst, columnist, unpublished novelist, and longtime LGBTQ activist who was a part of both Queer Nation and ACT UP New York, James Finn. How are you doing today, James?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for inviting me. And you can call me he, him if you need to use a pronoun.
Okay, and we're very happy to have you. Thank you. Our interview today will be focusing on the 1980s, a time period when the AIDS crisis struck our nation with immense force and left the LGBT community devastated. Between 1981 and 1987, over 4,000 people died of AIDS in the United States alone. Yet there was not a word uttered about this crisis by President Reagan or any of our leaders until September 1985. This was 4 years after the AIDS crisis began, and by then it had already grown into a full-blown epidemic. Unwilling to suffer this neglect any longer, Larry Kramer and other members of the LGBT community gathered together to form ACT UP New York in March of 1987. The sole purpose of this organization was to, through demonstration, protest against negligent government while educating the public on the dreadful consequences of the AIDS epidemic. If it had not been for the role of LGBTQ activists during that time, there would have not been a federal regulations passed to ensure the health and safety of anyone infected with the virus. So for this interview, I would like to start with the question, what was ACT UP New York and Queer Nation, and how did you get started with those organizations?
I got started with both organizations in 1990. So I wasn't there for the birth in 1987. I arrived in New York in March of 1990, having left the Air Force after deciding that being a gay man was too risky for me in my chosen career field. I stood a very strong chance of losing my security clearance and possibly receiving a bad or less than honorable discharge. So I flipped a coin. I could have ended up in New York or I could have ended up in San Francisco. and so New York it became. I took whatever I had left of my savings and lived there for a few months until I got on my feet. And I was delighted and shocked at the same time. I had been living largely in Europe for the last several years before that, and in the U.S. military, I had been isolated from the AIDS epidemic. I'd heard about it, but I had very little experience with it, even intersecting a little bit like I did with the queer community in Berlin. When I got to New York, I very quickly hooked up with the man who became my partner. And through his network of friends and loved ones, I learned with horror that people were dying in shocking numbers. It didn't take me long to go to an ACT UP meeting. I think my first ACT UP meeting was in October of 1990. Where I quickly met a young man named Brad, who became my best friend for years. He introduced me to Queer Nation, and we began to go to both of those kind of meetings. And I stayed fully involved even after Brad sadly died of AIDS. I tell people that one Christmas, my partner Lenny and I were doing our cards, and I grabbed his address book and I started writing out Christmas cards. And he walked over to the dining table and he looked down and he shook his head as he looked at the list, and he said, no, give me that. And he took the address book and slowly he started crossing out names. And it didn't take me long to realize that he was crossing out like a third of the people in that book who were no longer alive, most of them because of AIDS. I still have the book. I've lined out half of the entries in it. That may not be normal for most gay men in the United States, but it was normal for us because we lived in that world surrounded by people who were particularly hard hit by HIV and AIDS, especially since so many of our friends were part of AIDS activist circles. So that's how I got involved.
First, can I just say that I thought it was very brave of you to make that leap from like leaving the army to going to New York. Even just something so different, I think, is admirable. And I also want to say I am very sorry for the countless losses that you have felt over the years, but we all really appreciate your work here.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I don't know how brave I was actually being. I needed to be out. I needed to be gay and not hiding anymore. And I figured the only way that I could do that, things are different now. The only way I could do that then was to go to a big urban center. I couldn't go back to my rural roots. I'd be hiding again.
Yeah.
So
there just wasn't a community in the, at least a visible one,
really.
in a lot of rural areas.
Not really. I mean, there were proto communities and there were things that you could do, but I was tired of that. I'd been doing that for years and years, and I was sick of it. I had to stop. I had to be all the way out. Next question.
Yeah, so in the chapter, Brad grabs his balls and looks death in the eye from your book. There's a part where Brad and Luke went to a Queer Nation protest where they were chanting, "We here, we're queer, get used to it," and bash back, bash back. I was wondering what it was like to be part of Queer Nation, and how was it the same and or different from ACT UP? Additionally, what was their role in the gay liberation movement?
Okay, so I wasn't in that particular protest, although I wrote it very intimately because I talked to Brad about it many times, and not just Brad, but many people who were there. Most of the Queer Nation Zaps that I went to were more like Zaps. They were quick street theater designed to draw media attention, be controversial, and raise talking points that would be very easy to stay focused on in the media. When this was a new idea at the time, you know, you see politicians today do that constantly, you know, stay on page, stay on point. That was new. And in large part, we were doing it because we had very media savvy people like Ann Northrup involved in our movements. She was a professional journalist. She was part of the new wave of people who were talking about how to do media communication for protest. And so we had these little note cards, and that if anybody, this was both at Queer Nation and ACT UP. I mean, we got these little note cards before we ever went out. And on one side would be phone numbers that we could call, you know, to get us bailed out of jail. And the other side were, these are the 3 questions. These are the only 3 questions we want you to answer. And this is exactly how we want, these are the exact words we want you to answer them with. And that was amazingly effective for us. Because the whole point of street theater at that time, and it's a little different from what went on in the summer of 2020 with massive protests. Our protests were usually not massive. They were usually very small. They weren't designed to project power. They were designed to attract media. And of course, we arranged that in advance anyway. But that one, the chapter you were asking about, I did do a couple large actions like that with Queer Nation, and they were both terrifying and exhilarating and liberating at the same time. I went to one a few months after that where, okay, I have to back up. I have to tell you why Queer Nation was founded. In the winter of 1989 through the spring and summer of 1990, a wave of violence overcame the East and West Village and other gay neighborhoods in New York City. By that time, we were no longer really calling it the gay liberation movement, by the way. We were queer. We were LGBT. The LGBT Center on 13th Street was already called the LGBT Center. And gay had already started to mean more like a homosexual man than a queer person. Mm-hmm. At one time, gay was more of an umbrella term, but it had already stopped being that. So, sorry, that just a sidetrack. But
Fine.
but so Queer Nation was founded, the Pink Panthers were founded, and it was a take back the streets kind of thing. Queer Nation was really a project of a man by the name of Michelangelo Signorelli. He was its heart and soul. The White Horse Tavern in Greenwich Village didn't want gay men going in and drinking or lesbians and that sort of thing. And one of his early actions was going in and doing, a drink-in, bringing 30 queer people into the bar and sitting down and not going anywhere. That was sort of the early Queer Nation stuff. Then it morphed into Take Back the Streets because a lot of bad violence was going on. My partner and I, a year later, actually got bashed at the end of Christopher Street, in the Hudson there. And the Guardian Angels weren't helping. And in fact, they were often part of the problem. They were often, dishing out some of the bashing themselves. I attended a big street rally where we began to be harassed and chased by some people who were trying to, pick us off the margins. Not cops, people on the street who were trying to pick us off the margins and, beat us up. And that got really crazy. And I think part of the chapter that I wrote, I think some of the flavor of the one that I actually attended got into that, because it was it was unifying and liberating at the same time as it was terrifying. And also, if you Google it, you'll find out that we didn't really behave ourselves. Some of us chased a gang of guys into a building and may have very badly physically harmed some of them. And the cops had to come and actually pull us off of them. So anyway, but mostly what it was like was being part of a smaller activity, being part of a highly scripted, highly organized, small demonstration designed to attract media attention so that we could project a carefully tailored message to the nation.
Yeah.
So
that kind of brings me to my next question, really. So can you describe what it was like preparing for a protest?
Sure.
And were the police as brutal to you guys as they were to more modern day protesters?
Okay, I mean, kind of two separate questions, I guess.
Yeah.
What it was
wasn't
like
my question that I wrote.
That's fine. What it was like to prepare is, so every Tuesday we had an ACT UP general meeting, and normally some of the leadership would sort of debate, and I say leadership very, very guardedly because we didn't have any formal leaders. ACT UP prided itself in that, and neither did Queer Nation. But we still had a lot of people like Ann Northrup or Bill Dobbs, or early on Larry Kramer, not so much later, who would be more apt to stand up and speak than other people. And Ann Northrup ran the media committee, so she would often be giving out instructions for the message that we were going to be on at whatever the next protest was. And we'd all listen very carefully to that. And then there would be debate over, what kind of theatrics we'd be involved in. There'd be talk about logistical things, transportation. I mean, are we going to have buses? Or are we going to need to get there in our own vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. And it was kind of like going to gay church. We'd all be there and we'd all be together drinking bad coffee out of silver urns. And or people who go to AA meetings might recognize the same motif. It's all about the bad coffee. So that's what we do. And then we'd get together. Most of the demos were small. If you read the chapter about the one though on Long Island in the cemetery, that was pretty big. There were several busfuls of us. And that's when it would get scary, because the more of us were going to be there, the more cops would be there waiting for us. The more cops and the bigger the crowd, the more violent things would be. And everybody on both sides knew that. When it was just, I did all kind of little safer sex zaps because I was on the safer sex committee. That's mostly what I did. I danced in booty shorts in the park in Washington Square Park and threw glittery condoms and things like that. And we'd descend on the park, we'd take it over briefly for a half an hour doing something like that, and then we'd run away again. And those kind of things weren't scary; they were mostly just fun. But the big actions were scary. To more specifically answer your question, when things were small, we weren't scared of the cops. They were professional. They had a job to do. They didn't feel threatened by us because we weren't in big crowds. So we just basically either did what they told us to do or told them we weren't going to, and let's negotiate how we're going to handle that. and it moved on. It's like, okay, at 20 minutes in, you can start handcuffing us or whatever, But at the big ones, then if the cops felt threatened, they would get violent. And that's kind of what happened in that chapter that I wrote. And also because they weren't New York City cops, they didn't know us. And that made a difference too. Not that it always made a difference everywhere. I was not part of ACT UP Chicago, but cops in Chicago were vicious to ACT UP Chicago. I mean, they beat the fuck out of people on a regular basis. So I never got beaten up, but there's a question coming that's going to shock you a little bit when I answer it, but we'll wait for that. Did I answer your question?
No, yeah, you did.
Okay.
I hesitate to ask this because I really don't ever want to frame the AIDS crisis in terms of a good thing or like, well, it was bad, but there was some good to it. I really, really dislike that narrative, and I have heard it on occasion by usually cishet allies, in quotation marks, who don't really understand the scale. But I did want to ask this question because it was something that occurred to me. Do you think that the AIDS crisis in certain cases made cishet people more sympathetic towards the LGBT rights movement? Because obviously there was a movement before, but even though the crisis did increase the stigma, for example, like Princess Diana, or a more drastic example is the televangelist Tammy Faye Baker, who, despite being a televangelist, was one of the first televangelists to say, no, the AIDS crisis is super bad, and as Christians, we need to support them regardless of anything, because people need help. And I think, so I was wondering if you thought, like, if while the stigma did increase a lot on gay people, if there was also some benefit to that in just kind of other circles of the civil rights movement overall.
I think there was huge benefit, and I am as reluctant to say that as you are to ask. But I've written about this, and some people disagree with me, and some people disagree with me passionately, and that's fine. But I was there, and from what I saw, is that all these guys like me, young men who went to places like New York City and Chicago and Los Angeles and San Francisco and all those other urban centers where they had to go to find community and where they had to go to be together, contracted this terrible virus and became horribly sick and died. But before they died, they went home and they came out. They had to. You don't have AIDS for no reason. I mean, I hate to repeat the stigma, but the people going home had AIDS because they were gay, and everybody knew that. So all these people who could have just been quietly in the closet, or somebody's little secret, we love you, but we're not going to talk about your identity. People didn't have that option anymore. Johnny was dying. He was dying because he was gay. And God damn it, we have to do something about that. And so So what's the most powerful thing any queer person can do to win acceptance for themselves and their loved ones? And come out of the closet, right? I mean, we can't always do it, understood, no pressure, but that still, to this day, remains the most powerful thing each and every one of us can do. And when hundreds of thousands of us all came out of the closet at once, that crystallized a wave of empathy and acceptance that I've never seen the likes of since. You know what red ribbons are? You young people?
I believe so, but I've heard of the term, like the idea of red ribbon, but usually that's reused for drug awareness and stuff. So I want to clarify what red ribbon is.
So for much of the late 90s and early much of the late 80s through the early to mid 90s, everybody was wearing a red ribbon. You couldn't watch an Academy Award show without the red carpet being swarmed by all these famous actors and actresses with little red ribbons on their clothing. And those red ribbons stood for AIDS awareness. And it became something that you kind of had to do unless you were a dick. You had to wear a red ribbon. And everybody was doing this. And this is going to get into something we may be talking about later. But one of the things that made ACT UP so powerful, people think of the things that we did that were obnoxious and angry and all of that. But, and you can argue whether or not we should have done some of those things. But what they forget is that we weren't doing it to project our anger on our fellow Americans. We were doing it because we already had them on our side. They were already with us. They were already angry with us. And so that's what our street theater was about, engaging their anger and their empathy. And that was because so many of us had gone home to die. And if we had not, I don't think that would have happened. So it's complicated because I could be wrong. I mean, it's a very, very hard question to answer. And as passionately as I've just answered it in one direction, you'll hear people answering it very differently. Yeah. And, who knows? I don't know.
Yeah, someone could take that same logic and say that maybe it solidified their fear of homosexuality because now it was lethal and they lost. One could argue that a family may have felt they lost a loved one to them being gay.
And that undoubtedly happened sometimes. Yeah. It did, absolutely. I believe, based on what I saw, that it went the other way most of the time. But that's just my feeling.
There's lots of examples of families who are conservative, but love their kid. And it's like, listen, sure. I don't believe in it, but I love you and I can't separate my love. I can't separate that from you. And I understand that now. So I definitely can see it both ways. And that's kind of why I wanted your perspective.
Yeah. And I'm kind of with you there. My dad was, until he recently passed away, when I was growing up, he was a conservative Baptist pastor. And it was bad. He wasn't doing anything to me on purpose because he didn't, know. But, the shit that I grew up with was bad. And he became my biggest ally because parental love is one of the strongest forces in the universe. So, Dick Cheney, Liz Cheney, for example. So.
I think one thing that is interesting is, of course, there's a lot of different ways that people in and outside of the community reacted to the AIDS epidemic. One of the things that's really frustrating about it is, like, as unfortunate as it is, all of the loss that happened during that time did help to garner sympathy and support for people in our community. But I think the thing that a lot of people would struggle with, like something that I would struggle with thinking about it, is that people in our community shouldn't have had to go through something like that to get sympathy or to get respect or to be treated like human beings. So I feel like that's coming from me who wasn't even alive during the time, but I feel like people who were alive at that time would definitely struggle a lot with those kinds of ideas and looking at that stuff in a positive light, just because of how upsetting the truth of it is. I just thought that was something I wanted to put out there.
Well, you know what? My friend Brad got AIDS on purpose. That's how hard it was for him. He seroconverted on purpose. That's what the book's about. So yeah, I hear you. And it was hard. And some people didn't deal with it. Some people couldn't handle it. Brad couldn't handle it. So
yeah. Sort of shifting gears a little bit, a lot of the activism during the AIDS epidemic coming from organizations like Act Up New York was focused specifically around healthcare in regards to like drug testing and pushing for medication and support. I was wondering if your experience being a part of that movement during that time, what your opinion or involvement with modern day movements to reform healthcare and our drug industry would be like, because a lot of the problems back then are still issues like high prescription drug prices, lack of insurance and stuff like that. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but it's just, I also ask that because a lot of the people who have issues with access to healthcare and things they need happen to be minorities, which does often include LGBT people. So seeing that it still is an issue today, just in a different way, I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
You know, ACT UP still exists, right? You know why? Because AIDS isn't gone yet. HIV isn't gone yet. And one of the reasons it's not gone yet is because we as a people have not decided to spend national will or treasure on what we know could eradicate it tomorrow. AIDS is a problem. HIV is a problem in communities of color, especially in the rural South. Marginalized people are highly disproportionately likely to be HIV positive, are highly disproportionately unlikely to have access to the kind of testing and treatment that would extend their lives and make it impossible for them to transmit the virus to anyone. You know that if you take antiretrovirals, you know that if you're ineffective treatment, you can't give somebody HIV in almost any way at all. Certainly not by having sex with them, probably not by giving them a liter of your blood. And yet, in communities like Atlanta, in communities like Montgomery, Alabama, all over the nation, where you find marginalized communities, primarily Black communities and Hispanic communities, indigenous communities, you find stubborn rates of HIV persistence because they don't have access to healthcare and because we as a people won't do anything about it. Hello,
I can
COVID.
confirm that.
I mean, so that brings us right up. Yeah, we're not having successful health outcomes in the United States because we don't have universal access to healthcare. And that is one of ACT UP's biggest priorities right now, today. So
I feel like sort of silly because I didn't really know that that was a thing going on. I feel that's one thing you mentioned. This is sort of skipping ahead a little bit in the questions that we had. I mean, it's more discussion than questions, but with the way that media has evolved and with the way that LGBT like rights and activism has evolved, sometimes it feels like things are really spread out. It would, I don't know, I think it would be, considering how like big of an issue healthcare is, it would be really cool if we could figure out a way to have like widespread movements like that.
Yeah, it's hard. Healthcare is a political hot button. I mean, you know, Hillary tried during her husband's presidency and got destroyed for it. It may be one of the reasons she never became president herself. It's crazy. The American people have been conditioned to believe that universal healthcare will make our healthcare system worse, when in fact we already, in terms of outcome and access to care, have one of the worst systems of any developed nation in the world. Well, actually, I'm wrong. we don't have one of the worst systems of any developed nation in the world. We have the worst.
The worst.
By any way you choose to measure it, by any metric.
And
But,
sorry.
Nope, you're okay. Continue.
No, I guess I finished my thought. Sorry.
I was going to say on that note, we talked about how it's often like minority groups that are affected. But another thing is, if I recall, in Indiana, where we record the podcast, due to the opioid crisis, especially in high poverty areas of Indiana, which are predominantly white, but just white low poverty areas, there is a huge revival of AIDS happening.
Yes.
And I think that this kind of plays, when we talk about healthcare, plays into a very frustrating situation, which is that the rich, big pharma or whatever has convinced poor white people that a universal health care and those sorts of things are bad because of how it's going to be taken advantage of. But the people who need it most are now against it. And that applies to a lot of conditions. And
that applies across the political board of the United States for so many things. I mean, just look at how Senator Manchin is, scuttling so much right now, even though he represents some of the poorest, most underprivileged people in the United States, because they're convinced. I mean, he's not helping. He's using their not being convinced, but because they're convinced that a proper social safety net will make the country poorer and make their worlds and their lives worse. When of course that's absurd. Mm-hmm. But it's a big problem. I don't have any answers. I don't know how to answer your question. I don't know how we do it. People who are way smarter than me, have been working on this since I've been a little kid, and nobody's figured it out yet. I mean, what the Democrats are trying to do tonight in Washington, D.C. I mean, they're debating amongst themselves right now as we speak. They're caucusing, and they're getting screwed too. I mean, Semena and Manchin and moderate Democrats are it's so discouraging, because we were on the brink of revolutionary change, and it is very likely not going to happen again.
I feel like sadly one of the greatest threats to our political system at the moment to getting any type of change done is like the Democrats who are barely Democrats and more so centrists with wealth hoarding issues that seem to have grown in numbers over the past few years.
It's hard. It's hard. People convinced to vote against their own economic interests. This is when I was a little boy. My dad, this is before he became a preacher. My dad was a steel worker. He was just an ordinary blue collar steel worker guy. He bought a house when I was 2 years old that was worth his annual salary. My mom didn't work outside the house. We had 2 cars, and we went on a family vacation most summers. Nobody lives like that anymore. People don't see what they've lost. I see it because, I'm almost 60 and I lived through most of it. I watched it happen. I watched American working people go from some of the most prosperous people in the world. I mean, I should be very careful how I express that, because, that's a very white perspective. But still, things have gotten worse across the board, no matter where you look. And people don't see it, and they continue to vote against their economic interests. Mm-hmm. So it's really discouraging.
So something that you mentioned earlier when you talked about, you kind of made an allusion to COVID. Yeah. And I did want to bring that up because while the circumstances and details are obviously wildly different, I wanted to know from your perspective, is there a comparison to be made between Reagan's handling of the AIDS crisis and Trump's handling of the pandemic? I also want to especially note that because we noticed, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, some of the groups that were most commonly hit and died from COVID were actually minority groups and people of color. And so I wondered if that also kind of had enough. And if that had an effect on Trump's reaction to it in the same way that it affected Reagan's response to the AIDS crisis.
Some, I mean, there are a lot of really spooky parallels between HIV and the coronavirus, including Dr. Anthony Fauci, who has been the hero of both pandemics. Anthony Fauci and Peter Staley, the ACT UP and TAG leader, worked together in a way that probably saved more lives than anyone could imagine. But no, I mean, some of the parallels are really spooky and some of them are really important, but I don't think the Reagan-Trump one is. As much as Trump, beat his breast about the vaccines, the amazing vaccines that nobody had ever seen the like of before and whatnot and so forth, he didn't have anything to do with that. It had nothing to do with
his supporters still don't get them.
Policy. The pharmaceuticals jumped on those vaccines, by the way, made possible because of virus research that was done because of HIV. If it had not been for that research, we would not have had coronavirus vaccines as quickly as we had them, or maybe not even yet. The state of medical knowledge, the state of virology advanced by light years because of the work put into HIV, because it actually did threaten to become a global pandemic, and it did become a devastating pandemic in Eastern and Southern Africa, by the way, and is only beginning to improve now. But no, Trump didn't have anything to do with developing those vaccines. We didn't need the pharmaceutical industry to have a boot put up its ass to do something that was going to be amazingly profitable and has become amazingly profitable for them. The reason we needed that boot with HIV is that not enough people had it. In the 80s and early 90s, it was still assumed that HIV was always going to be a marginalized phenomenon, that he was only ever going to, be a serious problem for men who have sex with men and, people who do intravenous drugs and share needles and whatnot and so forth. The existentially scary epidemic in Africa didn't even start until effective treatment already existed. It was so much slower because it took longer to get into, because it's much harder to get HIV with, mixed gender sex. It's just not as easy. So by the time it gets insinuated into a community where in some parts of Southern Africa, by the way, one out of every 5 adults has HIV. Think about that. 1 out of every 5. So it doesn't have to be easy to catch when that many people have it, but that's why it took longer. So my point is that's why they didn't care. That's why Reagan didn't do anything, because he didn't think he had to. The pharmaceutical industry wasn't interested in HIV drugs because they didn't see any huge money in it for them. That was very different with the coronavirus, which, being, airborne transmitted and, with this huge R value and whatnot. It was obviously going to become a global crisis. We knew that as early as, February, March of 2020. So yeah, they were scrambling. And
well, can I say that Ronald Reagan did do one good thing?
What's that?
He died.
Yes. Yeah. Ronald Reagan is responsible for a lot of what's going on in the United States right now. Yes, I'm personally grieved and angry, that he didn't care enough about HIV to say anything, to mobilize the nation. A stronger, more moral leader could have made a big difference in those early years. But at the same time that he was not caring about HIV, he was firing air traffic controllers. He was destroying the labor movement. He was doing everything that led up to the problems that we're dealing with today. His trickle-down economics theories, all of this stuff that led to huge wealth disparity, all of it contributed to bad outcomes from marginalized people in the coronavirus epidemic, but in all kind of other things too. I'm slightly left of most of the leftist members of the Democratic Party, so don't get me going.
I could go on for hours. Don't give me the opportunity.
Yeah. I think you're probably I think the radicals out leveled the centrists in this podcast, probably, but
probably. Yeah. And that's, you know what? It's hard. Everybody I know still know, and I know a lot, everybody I still know from ACT UP and Queer Nation are some radical bitches. So, I mean, some of us, like Peter Staley, dude was a stockbroker, man. Dude was a millionaire. And he's one of the most radical firebrands, in the nation today. AIDS radicalized us. So, because we saw, what I did during the day, I don't write about this a lot. I mean, I spent my Tuesday nights and my evenings at committee meetings and, ACT UP committee meetings, and my weekends, out in the streets and whatnot. But during the day, I was the IT manager for an agency that did job placement and training for people living with HIV, men and women living with HIV. And I got hired because of my ACT UP connections. And, when I went to the interview, I was told what I'd be doing, and that one was all cool. And I had all these ideas in my head about what I was doing. And what I learned really fast is that it was nothing like what I thought it was going to be, because guess what? All these white people in New York City who have HIV and AIDS don't need job training and placement, because they're in New York City because they have jobs. So I ended up working with this big agency that served, Black, Puerto Rican, and Dominican people. And that radicalized me probably as much or more than my actual experiences with ACT UP, because I got to see up close and personal, all these people who were just getting treated like dirt. I mean, I don't know any other way to say it. And just, Joanne was this like 55-year-old Black grandmother who'd been a heroin user most of her life. And, heroin isn't really all that, I don't know how much I should talk about this, but I mean, heroin isn't intrinsically all that toxic to the body. You know that, right? I mean, you can be a heroin user for decades and be, not the healthiest person in the world, but you could be okay. The reason that people suffer so desperately from heroin abuse is society's reaction to the heroin use, not the heroin. I mean, it's not good for you. I'm not suggesting that people should go use opioids. It's, bad stuff. But so all Joanne wanted to do was get a job and show her grandchildren that she was being responsible and someone that they could look up to. She wanted to do that before she died of AIDS. And some of the biggest challenges to Joanne fulfilling her dream were the bureaucrats and politicians who ran New York City and New York State. I mean, racist policies, racist laws, I mean, we had to kick Joanne out of the program at one point because she tested positive for heroin or for something. It probably wasn't heroin. I think, if I remember, it was something else, but it was an opioid. And because we had this zero tolerance policy that state bureaucrats had said, and we're like, well, what are you doing? She's succeeding. But we had to kick her out or lose our funding because the regulations and the laws that govern our agency were despicably racist. Despicably racist. So
I think for me that is it sucks to hear that happening, but it also highlights the importance of intersectionality in these movements.
Right.
Because being able to properly support people at that time who are catching HIV and AIDS, you had to be able to support varying kinds of people, whether not regarding like class or race or things like that. Like you had to be able to account for all those differences. And in moments like that where that wasn't happening, like it hurt multiple different, I don't know. It's always interesting to me how big of a role intersectionality plays in things like this. I feel like sometimes looking back on history, that kind of can get overshadowed sometimes.
Sure. And, you know, my ground zero experience of the HIV AIDS epidemic is Lower Manhattan. And, you know, I don't know if any of you know much about New York, but I mean, it can kind of look white on the news, but honey, New York ain't white. I mean, you know, it's not. And intersectionality played a big role in how ACT UP operated. A lot of us boys on the back of the wall were not white. And some of the leaders that we think about, Peter Staley and Ann Northrop and Larry Kramer and Bill Dobbs, you know, they were white, and they would be the first to tell you that, you know, they used their whiteness to step up to the plate. And that's, but the reality was that a lot of what we were fighting was mostly affecting much more marginalized people. We get these romantic notions from the news and from history books and from, you know, the things that people on the ground decided to film, that white people were centered in the AIDS crisis, and that just isn't so. The people that I worked with every day, the people suffering and getting sick and dying, were Black, were Dominican, were Puerto Rican, because that's the population. That was the population of my city, and it's sad to open a history book and see a sea of white faces staring back when you learn about HIV, because that's not what I saw. That's not the suffering that I was part of. I mean, yeah, lots of my white friends were dying too. Don't get that happened, but it's just, I don't know. I think history paints it differently. History doesn't paint what I lived through. When I pick up a book about HIV, I see some things that did happen, but I don't see a lot of things that did happen too. So
I can agree a lot there. I actually grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, and my first experience with like the HIV and AIDS issue was just talking to a lot of my classmates who were LGBTQ and had all of these people that they looked up to having HIV or AIDS and having to live with it. And that's, you know, how I learned about what was going on. And I think that's what made me so passionate about the subject too.
Yeah. Oh, here's a story. I don't know if this can maybe make it in somewhere, but I live in northwestern Michigan right now, way out in the boonies among the Amish and the horses. But until a few years ago, I lived in Detroit, and I have a good friend there who is a physician, and we were sitting in a bar one night by the Wayne State campus, and we ended up talking to this guy who turns out that he's a doctor, and he was asking us why we were talking about HIV, because we were just shooting the shit, my friend and I, about my activism years. And so we told him why, and I told him I was working on an article about AIDS, and he said, well, you have to come visit me at work. He worked at an AIDS ward at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. Who knew that an AIDS ward anywhere in the United States still existed in 2016? But it did. And, you know, we did. My doctor friend and I went to Henry Ford. We toured the ward, and there were a good couple dozen people there in advanced states of AIDS, not HIV, AIDS, emaciated, KS lesions, you name it, all the classic symptoms. How can that be in the United States? It takes 10 years, you know, on average, for a case of active HIV to turn into full-blown AIDS that manifests with those sorts of opportunistic infections. 10 years of not receiving health care. 10 years. And at any point after the onset of opportunistic infections, any of those people could have begun combination therapy and recovered. All they had to do was go to the doctor one time, and get, a course of treatment started.
Well, I could go off on how the Black community does not have very much trust in the healthcare system because of all of the experiments that have gone on and all of the really bad stuff that has happened throughout history. But I don't think that's really my place to talk.
And I think that there's part of that is involved. Part of that is definitely involved with the problem in Detroit. Although, let's also acknowledge that Detroit is run by Black people, and that most of the doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals in Detroit are Black people. So it's a little bit I'm not saying it's totally different there, but it's a little bit different there. So a lot of the problem there's some problem of mistrust going on in Black communities in Detroit, but there's a lot, I think, at least, there's a lot more problem with actual systemic lack of access to care. I don't think that the majority of the people in that AIDS ward were there because they mistrusted doctors and didn't go see them. I think for the most part, it's because they couldn't get effective access to healthcare.
You also, in some cases, will have people of color who go to the doctor and try to tell the doctor symptoms or issues they have, but then get shut down by the doctor or told that they're wrong. I hear this a lot from Black women, especially, talking about having pains or issues and then just being blown off as something else, or it's not serious, so we're not going to test you for anything. So racism that's within our healthcare, that's a systemic issue, is also a big issue in that.
Right. Especially Black women in the whole pain thing. I write with a Black woman activist who has done a series of articles about that in terms of, until very recently, in fact, some doctors in medical school learned that Black women in particular have a higher pain tolerance than other people. So, which is just, decidedly not true. There's no data support that. But doctors learned it anyway. So,
if it's all right, I would like to switch gears on a question that I accidentally skipped over.
Yep.
Okay. So, what was the most surprising and/or shocking thing you experienced at a protest?
I have been waiting for this question. I almost got my arm ripped off.
What?
Yes. This ties into the question about police brutality also. This was toward the end of my activist days. This is after effective treatment had already come out. We were in Connecticut doing something. We were protesting pretty much on the front lawn of a pharmaceutical executive's house, doing the usual act up shaming and shunning thing that people tell us we're naughty to do. But that's what we were doing. We wanted this guy's neighbors to know that he personally was refusing to lower prices on life-saving drugs. So we were out there being assholes. And I have been writing bulldozers for years, but a friend of mine contacted me a couple of weeks ago and said, "No, you idiot, it was just a big forklift." But anyway, we had some piece of heavy equipment out there. A friend had brought it, and some of us had chained ourselves to a lamppost and chained ourselves to the bulldozer, forklift, whatever it was, so that the cops couldn't get us off the lawn. And we were being as theatrical as we could be. And the cops were sick of us. Really late at night, a couple of them came up to us and said, "Okay, we're done. Get up, unchain yourselves, and get the fuck out of here, or some bad shit's going to go down. Because we're tired and we want to go home. You made your point. We're done." And a couple of people were like, "Yeah, you're right." But I was being really stubborn, and I said, "Nope, I'm sitting right here. Y'all can stay here if you want. Y'all can go have donuts if you want. But I have a book. I'm chained up and I'm not moving. And the cops had somebody get on the bulldozer, forklift, or whatever it was, and start it up. And they said to me, "You can move, or we're taking your arm." And the guy who was driving, he wasn't a cop. He was some kind of a civilian contractor with him. He was definitely there with him on team cop, you know. He started it up and it started to move. And I started to like, oh my God, what the they're really, and they're really going to do this. And then the driver stood up and said, "Fuck this." And grabbed the key out of the ignition, threw it on the ground and said, "Y'all do what you want. I'm the fuck out of here." And the shocking part to me, and again, I've had friends contact me since, and it's like, you may be over dramatizing this a little bit. I don't think they were as close to ripping your arm off as you think they were. but I was the one sitting there with the chain on my arm, you know, and the machine was started. And the cops were standing there looking like they wanted the dude to drive off and take my arm with him. And
well, I mean, if they were behind the wheel, then I am fully convinced that they would have probably taken it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they all told themselves later that this is how we knew it was going to go down like this. We knew nothing was actually going to happen. But I was the one sitting there chained up. And yeah, when they started that machine up and he started to move, I really thought they were taking my arm. So that is the most shocking thing that ever happened to me on an active level.
Okay. So, in the words of the great historian Howard Zinn, missing from such histories are the countless small actions of unknown people that led up to those great moments. When we understand this, we can see that the tiniest acts of protest in which we engage may become invisible roots of social change. When you talk about Brad and the lives of those you lost to AIDS being gone forever, do you feel that the living, especially the younger generation, have a responsibility to take up the mantle and continue where they left off?
I guess. I think young people have a responsibility to take up their own mantle. I think, we're facing catastrophic climate change. We're facing economic collapse and continued economic marginalization in the United States. And I think that's enough right there. We're facing, we've still got brutal racist cops, killing Black people. Y'all have your issues. I mean, y'all have your own issues. You don't need to fulfill our legacy. I mean, you've got your work cut out for you. But I mean, as far as queer activism goes, yeah, I'm always gratified when young people want to hear about some of the things that came before. I mean, if we've got something to teach or to share about how we did things, or what we did then, they don't always apply to today, but sometimes they do. Sometimes tactics and strategies, get lost and need to be remembered again. But I don't feel that you owe us anything. I feel that you owe yourselves something. I feel that you owe yourselves a better world. I know it's not your fault that the world sucks, but the only people who are going to make the world suck less is you. So you might as well, right? I mean, I'm tired as fuck, man. I spent my life as an LGBTQ activist, and it's taken an enormous toll on my mental health and all sorts of other things, relationships and whatnot, and I'm done. I there's not much left. I don't have much left in me except to tell my stories. So, and cheer you guys on, because
we really appreciate that. Some of the only ways that, I mean, this is basically how I get my history, right? Talking to queer elders, they are spread very far and thin. That's like the only way that a lot of us younger queer people really get to like understand our history, right? Because there's nothing really written down about it. And so I think a lot of us, especially myself, a lot of us plan to go into activism. I can't speak for everybody here, but I plan on going into activism as much as I can, just because, yeah, as you said, there is so much wrong for our generation to take up and to have on our shoulders at the fault of corporations and billionaires trying to get everything their way and everything to be controlled by them. In our world is like, not even just our world. I think it's mostly just America that is suffering in this late stage capitalism, and that we, the younger generation, are the only ones really reaping like what it's going to be like for our future. A lot of other people don't really have to care as much, especially older white people. But let me rephrase that, older upper middle class white people, they don't have to worry about it as much as we do, because they're not going to be around for the disastrous effects. So I think it really is important that we continue on to fight for what we need.
Yep.
I do just want to add, like, late stage capitalism and just like negative experiences of youth with all of these big issues is like not just an America thing. It's like common all across the board, but it's extra highlighted in America just because we have so many major issues with our economic systems and our healthcare. It's just like, it's crazy here.
Although things are really, really awful in the UK right now. Really awful.
Yeah.
I have a lot of close friends in the UK, and it's going to be a hard winter. I mean, there are going to be people who don't have heat this winter. Their economy is collapsing. And, let's not even talk about Team Turf and, what's going on with transphobia in the UK right now, which is just insanely bad. I mentioned earlier that I think before we started that I publish and help edit this intersectional queer publication called Prism and Pen. And just by coincidence this summer, 2 of our trans writers from the UK were beaten in the street. One of them more than once. So that's how hard things have gotten. Have you been following did you see that BBC article that came out 3 days ago? That hatchet job, trans women pressuring cis lesbians to have sex.
That article rubs me the wrong way. One, because most trans women and trans lesbians I've met are not like that, and being trans doesn't make you inherently predatory in any way. But also, one of the cis women that they interviewed in that one takes pride in being a gold star lesbian, which is bullshit and garbage. If anyone listening doesn't know what that is, gold star lesbian, sorry, I'm going on a tangent, but it's a big thing for me, is like taking pride in not ever having sex with men in your lifetime. But one, I mean, most of the time people say that in a transphobic way. And 2, a lot of lesbians don't figure out that they're lesbians until later in life. So it's just like so unfair. Right. But she herself also has a history of being predatory and has multiple incidents of being a sexual assaulter towards multiple women. So no, do not, as a cis woman or as a cis lesbian, ever try to be transphobic as fuck when you yourself don't know how to respect people's boundaries. Okay, sorry, ran over.
So, I mean, if you want to read a brilliant rebuttal of that article, if y'all read Pink News, they're all over it. They're doing brilliant original reporting.
No, they need to. It's a terrible article. Not to mention, I'm pretty sure that the data on it is like a biased one. A lot of the people from their data are transphobic individuals.
There isn't even any data. No. The journalist highlighted that supposed survey, which is not by any means an academic study. It was a questionnaire put out from the membership of an explicitly anti-trans organization to explicitly anti-trans people. And the only people who saw the responses and measured them and put them into the so-called study were the leadership of the anti-trans organization. How do you even do this? How does the BBC even report something like that, making it sound like it's a study?
It's awful. It's all just bigotry and nonsense, and it's super upsetting.
So,
all right. So my final question for you is, since you have been on so many protests, both large scale and small scale, I was wondering, what are some top safety tips that you can provide to any of us or our listeners, since I know a lot of us are involved in protests ourselves?
Wow, I'm probably really, really out of date on this. This may be the question I am least qualified to answer. Back in my day, I mean, we were all urged to have our IDs on us, and our organizations were small enough that we always had lawyers on tap, and so we would surrender to the police and give up our IDs, and then get bailed out or get released or whatever, and it was all like on the level, and we it was a really different day. I think people are doing things very differently today. And also, this was in the days before less than lethal countermeasures by the police, which of course are not less than lethal, which are actually very lethal. The worst they ever did to us maybe would be like a fire hose, but which is not good, but a fire hose isn't very, very unlikely to kill you. But their so-called less than lethal measures today really do kill people.
Pepper spray, tasers. Yeah.
Well,
I learned a lot of techniques when I went to a bunch of BLM protests, which really involved just ways to fight off pepper spray and such. So
we didn't get pepper sprayed, but more importantly, I mean, we didn't get shot with rubber bullets, and we did not get we didn't get hit with beanbag rounds and things like that. Some of the things that have routinely been either killing or disabling people in the front lines of the BLM movement.
Yeah.
So, and the closest I am right now where I live and have been for years to anything where there might be a BLM protest is Grand Rapids, and I did go a couple times in the summer of 2020, and things were very tame.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know. Not my best question. So.
Yeah. Well, I guess this next one that is kind of tied to the first one. I don't know how relevant it would be to, but what were like the most comfortable shoes that you wore, like to a protest? Because I know a lot of them involve walking. That was just kind of like my fun question for the night.
Oh, weird. Gosh, boy, you're. Okay, so I had a couple different pairs of really comfy hiking boots, and those were my Zap Action protest boots. So
hiking boots, got it.
Hiking boots, really comfy hiking boots with comfy inserts.
Mm-hmm.
So you wanted something to protect your feet. You didn't want to be wearing sneakers or something like that. So.
The last question I want to end on, going slightly away from the subject of protesters, but on the section of advice and education, I guess, is I wanted to ask, how can we better educate the public or change the public perspective on Reagan and the AIDS crisis itself, / how it was handled? Because I know that there's still a lot of miscommunication on that front, or just going back to ACT UP and a lot of the things that we've learned today and talked about today. How do we address that in other circles, or how do we educate on that better?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, on a very personal level, it's disturbed me to see Reagan sort of become elevated to this, revered sort of loved grandfather figure.
My grandparents are from Illinois, which is the birthplace of Reagan. They have a whole statue in his childhood home is
right.
Like a form of Mecca. And so it's like, yeah.
Ew.
I mean, when I was y'all's age or younger, Reagan was viewed kind of the way, Trump was, or Trump is. I mean, we really, really viscerally disliked him. I mean, and it's just been this rehabilitation has been weird to me. I wish people would speak up more. I wish people would. I mean, I know you're not supposed to speak ill of the dead, but he's been dead a long time now. I wouldn't decimate his family during his funeral or whatever. I mean, you'd have to be a dick to do something like that. But because people love their families no matter who they are. But Reagan destroyed the prosperity of American working and middle class people. Besides the fact that hundreds of thousands or millions more people died of AIDS than would have needed to if he had marshaled the resources of the United States government against it when he had the opportunity. So I don't know how we revere him. I don't know how we revere, Bush, who sent us into Iraq on knowingly false intelligence. And here we treat him like he's everybody's favorite grandpa too. But
I guess maybe one of the things that I think, if you're trying to prove someone who's super pro Reagan, like, I guess one of the biggest cons I think Reagan ever pulled was creating the modern conservative movement and tricking a bunch of working class white Americans that they were on the same side as the uber capitalist corporations. And so I think that's what I would want to focus on changing.
Yeah. So telling stories is the most powerful form of activism that exists, right? So that's what ACT UP was all about, was telling stories. We did street theater. It was really theater. I mean, it was sometimes the communication was really simple and we only had one or two really simple points to get across, but it was always about storytelling. And so what's the story about Reagan that might resonate the most with American people today? Well, how about that story I told about my dad buying a house for the equivalent of his annual salary when he was just a regular factory worker? That's a powerful example. People can't do that today. People don't live like that today. People live way worse today. People have far lower standards of living today than when I was a kid because of the policies Reagan put in place, because he accelerated the destruction of the labor movement, and because he empowered uber capitalists, as you call them, to run the country. When y'all probably see this as normal. This is just how things are, but this isn't how things have been. This is new. We used to, back in the 50s and 60s, I'm only going to talk about post-war now, but I mean, back in the 50s and 60s, there were even Republican presidents and senators who actually looked out for the well-being of regular Americans. And nobody does that anymore. It's all about capitalism now. It's all about, we've got this idea, we've got this religious notion that it's almost a Randian, an Ayn Randian sort of notion, a religious idea that if we elevate self-interest or greed, as you might call it in more negative terms, if we elevate self-interest, then everybody will be better off. But that is bullshit. And we have enough data now. Okay, so maybe when Reagan was proposing it, we didn't have data, but we do now. We've seen what happened. Nobody is confused anymore. And we have to let people know that their lives are worse, measurably, noticeably worse, because that religious notion isn't true. It doesn't work.
That was very well put. And I am very grateful that you came out to talk to us today, because everything you've said so far is amazing. And I really hope that our viewers get something from this episode. So in conclusion, we would like to thank our special guest, James Finn, for joining us today. Oh, can you give our listeners all your information about where they can find you? So social media, something like that, if they want to look more into some of the things that you've talked about or your work.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, anyone who wants to can reach out to me at jamesfinnwrites@gmail.com. I can be found on medium.com, on Twitter as at jfinn6511. Sorry about the difficult handle. If I'd known that I was going to eventually have a somewhat public voice, I wouldn't have done that. But it's too late to do anything about it. J is in the letter J, Finn, Finn, 6511 on medium.com and Twitter. And you can find me on Facebook as James Finn Writes.
Thank you very much. And so we would like to take this time to thank our listeners for tuning in. It means a lot to all of us. If you want to listen to our other episodes, we are available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Music, Deezer, and Apple Podcasts. If you need someone to talk to, look up to the Trevor Project or Muncie Outreach. The suicide hotline is 800-273-8255. We all here care about you, so please take care of yourself. We will see you in the next episode. Goodbye.